The Ignorant Schoolmaster 5 Lessons in Intellectual Emancipation. Chapter 3. Reason Between Equals. Page 45. We must look further into the reason for these effects. We direct students based on an opinion about the equality of intelligence. What is an opinion? An opinion, the explicators respond, is a feeling we form about facts we have superficially observed. Opinions grow especially in weak and common minds, and they are the opposite of science, which knows the true reasons for phenomena. If you like, we will teach you science. Slow down. We grant you that an opinion is not a truth. But this is precisely what interests us. Whoever does not know the truth is looking for it, and there are many encounters to make along the way. The only mistake would be to take our opinions for the truth. Admittedly, this happens all the time. But this is precisely the one way that we want to distinguish ourselves, we others, the followers of the madman. We think that our opinions are opinions and nothing more. We have seen certain facts. We believe that this could be the reason for it. We, and you may do the same, will perform some other experiments to verify the solidity of the opinion. Besides, it seems to us that this procedure is not completely new. Didn't physicists and chemists often proceed in this way? And we speak then about hypothesis, about the scientific method, in a respectful tone. After all, respect means little to us. Let's limit ourselves to the facts. We have seen children and adults learn by themselves, without a master explicator, how to read, write, play music, and speak foreign languages. Page 46. We believe these facts can be explained by the equality of intelligence. This is an opinion whose verification we pursue. It's true there is a difficulty in all this. Physicists and chemists isolate physical phenomena and relate them to other physical phenomena. They set themselves to reproducing the known effects by producing their supposed causes. Such a procedure is forbidden us. We can never say, take two equal minds and place them in such and such a condition. We know intelligence by its effects. But we cannot isolate it, measure it. We are reduced to multiplying the experiments inspired by that opinion. But we can never say, all intelligence is equal. It's true. But our problem isn't proving that all intelligence is equal. It's seeing what can be done under that supposition. And for this, it's enough for us that the opinion be possible, that is, that no opposing truth be proved. Of brains and leaves. Precisely, say the superior minds. The opposite fact is obvious. That intelligence is unequal is evident to everyone. First of all, in nature, no two beings are identical. Look at the leaves falling from the tree. They seem exactly the same to you. Look more closely and disabuse yourself. Among the thousands of leaves, there are no two alike. Individuality is the law of the world. And how could this law that applies to vegetation not apply a fortiori to this being so infinitely more elevated in the vital hierarchy that is human intelligence? Therefore, each intelligence is different. Second, there have always been, there always will be, there are everywhere, beings unequally gifted for intellectual things, scholars and ignorant ones, intelligent people and fools, open minds and closed minds. We know what is said on the subject, the difference in circumstances, social milieu, education. Well, let's do an experiment. Let's take two children who come from the same milieu, raised in the same way. Let's take two brothers, put them in the same school, make them do the same exercises. Page 47. And what will we see? One will do better than the other. There is therefore an intrinsic difference. And the difference results from this: one of the two is more intelligent, more gifted, he has more resources than the other. Therefore, you can clearly see that intelligence is unequal. How to respond to this evidence? Let's begin at the beginning, with the leaves that superior minds are so fond of. We fully recognize that they are as different as people so minded could desire. We only ask, How does one move from the difference between leaves to the inequality of intelligence? Inequality is only a kind of difference, and it is not the one spoken about in the case of leaves. A leaf is a material thing while a mind is immaterial. How can one infer, without paralogism, the properties of the mind from the properties of matter? It is true that this terrain is now occupied by some fierce adversaries, physiologists. The properties of the mind, according to the most radical of them, are in fact the properties of the human brain. Difference and inequality hold sway there just as in the configuration and functioning of all the other organs in the human body. The brain weighs this much, so intelligence is worth that much. Phrenologists and cranioscopists are busy with all this. This man, they tell us, has the skull of a genius, this other doesn't have a head for mathematics. Let's leave these protuberants to the examination of their protuberances and get down to the serious business. One can imagine a consequent materialism that would be concerned only with brains, and that could apply to them everything that is applied to material beings. And so, effectively, the propositions of intellectual emancipation would be nothing but the dreams of bizarre brains, stricken with a particular form of that old mental malady called melancholia. In this case, superior minds, that is to say, superior brains, would in fact have authority over inferior minds in the same way man has authority over animals. If this were simply the case, nobody would discuss the inequality of intelligence. Superior brains would not go to the unnecessary trouble of proving their superiority over inferior minds incapable, by definition, of understanding them. Page 48. They would be content to dominate them. And they wouldn't run into any obstacles. Their intellectual superiority would be demonstrated by the fact of that domination, just like physical superiority. There would be no more need for laws, assemblies, and governments in the political order than there would be for teaching, explications, and academies in the intellectual order. Such is not the case. We have governments and laws. We have superior minds that try to teach and convince inferior minds. What is even stranger, the apostles of the inequality of intelligence, in their immense majority, don't believe the physiologists and make fun of the phrenologists. The superiority they boast of can't be measured, they believe, by instruments. Materialism would be an easy explanation for their superiority, but they make a different case. Their superiority is spiritual. They are spiritualists, above all, because of their own good opinion of themselves. They believe in the immaterial and immortal soul. But how can something immaterial be susceptible to more or less? This is the superior mind's contradiction. They want an immortal soul, a mind distinct from matter, and they want different degrees of intelligence. But it's matter that makes difference. If one insists on inequality, one must accept the theory of cerebral loci. If one insists on the spiritual principle, one must say that it is the same intelligence that applies, in different circumstances, to different material objects. But the superior minds want neither a superiority that would be only material nor a spirituality that would make them the equals of their inferiors. They lay claim to the differences of materialists in the midst of the elevation that belongs to immateriality. They paint the cranioscopist's skulls with the innate gifts of intelligence. And yet they know very well that the shoe pinches, and they also know they have to concede something to the inferiors, even if only provisionally. Here, then, is how they arrange things. There is in every man, they say, an immaterial soul. This soul permits even the most humble to know the great truths of good and evil, of conscience and duty, of God and judgment. Page 49. In this we are all equal, and we will even concede that the humble often teach us in these matters. Let them be satisfied with this and not pretend to intellectual capacities that are the privilege often dearly paid for of those whose task is to watch over the general interests of society. And don't come back and tell us that these differences are purely social. Look instead at these two children, who come from the same milieu, taught by the same masters. One succeeds, the other doesn't. Therefore, so be it. Let's look then at your children and your therefore. One succeeds better than the other, this is a fact. If he succeeds better, you say, this is because he is more intelligent. Here the explanation becomes obscure. Have you shown another fact that would be the cause of the first? If a physiologist found one of the brains to be narrower or lighter than the other, this would be a fact. He could therefore eyes deservedly. But you haven't shown us another fact. By saying he is more intelligent, you have simply summed up the ideas that tell the story of the fact. You have given it a name. But the name of a fact is not its cause, only, at best, its metaphor. The first time you told the story of the fact by saying, he succeeds better. In your retelling of it you used another name, he is more intelligent. But there is no more in the second statement than in the first. This man does better than the other because he is smarter. That means precisely, he does better because he does better. This young man has more resources, they say. What is more resources? I ask, and they start to tell me the story of the two children again. So more resources, I say to myself, means in French the set of facts I just heard, but that expression doesn't explain them at all. 1. It's impossible, therefore, to break out of the circle. One must show the cause of the inequality, at the risk of borrowing it from the protuberance, or be reduced to merely stating a tautology. The inequality of intelligence explains the inequality of intellectual manifestations in the way the Virtus Dormitiva explains the effects of opium. Page 50. An attentive animal. We know that a justification of the equality of intelligence would be equally tautological. We will therefore try a different path. We will talk only about what we see, we will name facts without pretending to assign them causes. The first fact, I see that man does things that other animals don't. I call this fact mind, intelligence, as I like, I explain nothing, I give a name to what I see. 2. I can also say that man is a reasonable animal. By that I am registering the fact that man has an articulated language that he uses to make words, figures, and comparisons for the purposes of communicating his thoughts to his fellow men. Second, when I compare two individuals, I see that in the first moments of life, they have absolutely the same intelligence, that is to say, they do exactly the same things, with the same goal, with the same intention. I say that these two humans have equal intelligence, and this phrase, equal intelligence, is shorthand for all the facts that I have observed watching two very young infants. Later, I will see different facts. I will confirm that the two minds are no longer doing the same things, are not obtaining the same results. I could say, if I wanted to, that one's intelligence is more developed than the other's, so long as I know that, here again, I am only recounting a new fact. Nothing prevents me from making a supposition about all this. I will not say that the one's faculties are inferior to the other's. I will only suppose that the two faculties haven't been equally exercised. Nothing proves this to me with certainty. But nothing proves the opposite. It is enough for me to know that this lack of exercise is possible, and that many experiments attest to it. I will thus displace the tautology very slightly. I will not say that he has done less well because he is less intelligent. I will say that he has perhaps produced a poorer work because he has worked more poorly, that he has not seen well because he hasn't looked well. I will say that he has brought less attention to his work. Page 51. By this I may not have advanced very far, but far enough, nevertheless, to break out of the circle. Attention is neither the skull surrounding the brain nor an occult quality. It is an immaterial fact in its principle, material in its effects. We have 1,000 ways of verifying its presence, its absence, or its greater or lesser intensity. All the exercises of universal teaching tend toward this. In the end, the inequality of attention is a phenomenon whose possible causes are reasonably suggested to us through experiment. We know why young children direct so similar an intelligence to exploring their world and learning their language. Instinct and need drive them equally. They all have just about the same needs to satisfy, and they all want equally to enter human society enjoying all the advantages and rights of speaking beings. and for this, intelligence must not come to a standstill. The child is surrounded by objects that speak to him, all at once, in different languages. He must study them separately and together. They have no relationship and often contradict each other. He can make nothing of all the idioms in which nature speaks to him through his eyes, his touch, through all his senses simultaneously. He must repeat often to remember so many absolutely arbitrary signs. What great attention is necessary for all that. 3. This giant step taken, the need becomes less imperious, the attention less constant, and the child gets used to learning through the eyes of others. Circumstances become diverse, and he develops the intellectual capacities as those circumstances demand. The same holds for the common people. It is useless to discuss whether their lesser intelligence is an effect of nature or an effect of society. They develop the intelligence that the needs and circumstances of their existence demand of them. There where need ceases, intelligence slumbers, unless some stronger will makes itself understood and says, continue, look at what you are doing and what you can do if you apply the same intelligence you have already made use of, by bringing to each thing the same attention, by not letting yourself stray from your path. Page 52. Let's sum up these observations and say, man is a will served by an intelligence. Perhaps saying that wills are unequally demanding suffices to explain the differences in attention that would perhaps suffice to explain the inequality of intellectual performances. Man is a will served by an intelligence. This formula is heir to a long history. Summing up the thought of the great 18th century minds, the poet-philosopher Jean-François de Saint-Lambert affirmed, man is a living organization served by an intelligence. The formula smacked of materialism, and during the Restoration, the apostle of counter-revolution, the Viscount de Bonald, strictly reversed it. Man, he proclaimed, is an intelligence served by organs. But this reversal caused a very ambiguous restoration of the intelligence. What the Viscount disliked about the philosopher's formula was not that it gave too small a part to human intelligence, he himself didn't grant it much. What he disliked was the republican model of a king at the service of a collective organization. What he wanted to restore was the good hierarchical order, a king who commands and subjects who obey. The sovereign intelligence, for him, was certainly not that of the child or worker, tending to the appropriation of a world of signs. It was the divine intelligence already inscribed in the codes given to man by the divinity, in the very language that owed its origin neither to nature nor to human art, but to the pure gift of God. Human will's lot was to submit itself to that intelligence already manifest, inscribed in codes, in language as in social institutions. Taking this stand brought with it a certain paradox. To ensure the triumph of social objectivity and the objectivity of language over the individualist philosophy of the Enlightenment, de Bonald had to take up in his turn the most materialist formulations of that same philosophy. In order to deny any anteriority of thought over language, in order to forbid intelligence any right to search for a truth of its own, he had to join up with those who had reduced mental operations to the pure mechanism of material sensations and linguistic signs, to the point of making fun of those monks on Mount Athos who, contemplating their navels, believed themselves visited by divine inspiration. 4 page 53. Thus that connaturality between linguistic signs and the ideas of understanding that the 18th century sought, and that the ideologues worked at finding, found itself recuperated, reversed to favor the primacy of the established, in the framework of a theocratic and sociocratic vision of the intelligence. Man, wrote the Viscount, thinks his speech before speaking his thought a materialist theory of language that does not allow us to ignore the pious thought that animates it, the faithful and perpetual guardian of the sacred depository of the fundamental truths of the social order. Society, considered in general, grants knowledge of all this to its children as they enter into the big family. 5 In the face of these strong thoughts, an angry hand scratched on his copy these lines. Compare all this scandalous verbiage with the oracle's response on the learned ignorance of Socrates. It isn't Joseph Jacotto's hand. It is the hand of de Bonald Col League in the chamber, the Knight Main de Byron, who, a little farther on, reverses the Viscount's entire edifice in 2 lines, the anteriority of linguistic signs changes nothing for the preeminence of the intellectual act that, for every human infant, gives them meaning. Man only learns to speak by linking ideas to the words he learns from his nurse. 6. At first glance this is an astonishing coincidence. At first it is difficult to see what the erstwhile lieutenant of Louis X v. Isgard and the erstwhile army captain from Year I, the administrative squire and the professor from the central school, the deputy of the monarch's chamber and the exiled revolutionary, could possibly have in common. At the most, we might think, the fact that both were 20 years old at the onset of the revolution, that both left the tumult of Paris at 25, and that both had meditated rather lengthily and at a distance on how much sense and virtue the old Socratic axiom might have had, or might have now, in the middle of so many upheavals. Jacoto understood the matter more in the manner of the moralists, Maine de Byron more metaphysically. Page 54. Nevertheless, there remains a common vision that upholds the same affirmation of the primacy of thought over linguistic signs, the same balance sheet of the analytic and ideological tradition in which both had formed their thinking. Self-knowledge and the power of reason are no longer to be sought in the reciprocal transparency of linguistic signs and the ideas of understanding. The arbitrariness of the will revolutionary and imperial has now entirely taken over the promised land of well-made languages that yesterday's reason promised. Thus the certitude of thought withdraws beyond the transparencies of language whether they be republican or theocratic. It bears on its own act, on that mental tension that precedes and orients any combination of signs. The divinity of the revolutionary and imperial era. The will finds its rationality at the heart of that effort each puts into himself, that autodetermination of the mind as activity. Intelligence is attention and research before being a combination of ideas. Will is the power to be moved, to act by its own movement, before being an instance of choice. A will served by an intelligence. It is this fundamental turnaround that the new reversal of the definition of man records. Man is a will served by an intelligence. Will is the rational power that must be delivered from the quarrels between the ideists and the thingists. It is also in this sense that the Cartesian equality of the cogito must be specified. In place of the thinking subject who only knows himself by withdrawing from all the senses and from all bodies, we have a new thinking subject who is aware of himself through the action he exerts on himself as on other bodies. Here is how Jacoto, according to the principles of universal teaching, made his own translation of Descartes' famous analysis of the piece of wax: I want to look and I see. I want to listen and I hear. I want to touch and my arm reaches out, wanders along the surfaces of objects or penetrates into their interior, my hand opens, develops, extends, closes up, my fingers spread out or move together by obeying my will. Page 55. In that act of touching, I know only my will to touch. That will is neither my hand, nor my brain, nor my touching. That will is me, my soul, it is my power, it is my faculty. I feel that will, it is present in me, it is myself. As for the manner in which I am obeyed, that I don't feel, that I only know by its acts. I consider ideation like touching. I have sensations when I like, I order my senses to bring them to me. I have ideas when I like, I order my intelligence to look for them, to feel. The hand and the intelligence are slaves, each with its own attributes. Man is a will served by an intelligence. 7 I have ideas when I like. Descartes knew well the power of will over understanding. But he knew it precisely as the power of the false, as the cause of error, the haste to affirm when the idea isn't clear and distinct. The opposite must be said, it is the lack of will that causes intelligence to make mistakes. The mind's original sin is not haste, but distraction, absence. To act without will or reflection does not produce an intellectual act. The effect that results from this cannot be classed among the products of intelligence, nor can it be compared to them. One can see neither more nor less action in inactivity, there is nothing. Idiocy is not a faculty, it is the absence or the slumber or the relaxation of intelligence. 8 Intelligence's act is to see and to compare what has been seen. It sees at first by chance. It must seek to repeat, to create the conditions to re-see what it has seen, in order to see similar facts, in order to see facts that could be the cause of what it has seen. It must also form words, sentences, and figures, in order to tell others what it has seen. In short, the most frequent mode of exercising intelligence, much to the dissatisfaction of geniuses, is repetition. And repetition is boring. The first vice is laziness. It is easier to absent oneself, to half-see, to say what one hasn't seen, to say what one believes one sees. Absent sentences are formed in this way, their force that translate no mental adventure. I can't is one of these absent sentences. I can't is not the name of any fact. Nothing happens in the mind that corresponds to that assertion. Properly speaking, it doesn't want to say anything. Page 56. Speech is thus filled or emptied of meaning depending on whether the will compels or relaxes the workings of the intelligence. Meaning is the work of the will. This is the secret of universal teaching. It is also the secret of those we call geniuses, the relentless work to bend the body to any necessary habits, to compel the intelligence to new ideas, to new ways of expressing them, to redo on purpose what chance once produced, and to reverse unhappy circumstances into occasions for success. This is true for orators as for children. The former are formed in assemblies as we are formed in life. He who, by chance, made people laugh at his expense at the last session could learn to get a laugh whenever he wants to, were he to study all the relations that led to the guffaws that so disconcerted him and made him close his mouth forever. Such was Demosthenes' debut. By making people laugh without meaning to, he learned how he could excite peals of laughter against Aeschines. But Demos thence wasn't lazy. He couldn't be. 9 Once more universal teaching proclaims, an individual can do anything he wants. But we must not mistake what wanting means. Universal teaching is not the key to success granted to the enterprising who explore the prodigious powers of the will. Nothing could be more opposed to the thought of emancipation than that advertising slogan. And the founder became irritated when disciples opened their school under the slogan, "Whoever wants to is able to." The only slogan that had value was the equality of intelligence. Universal teaching is not an expedient method. It is undoubtedly true that the ambitious and the conquerors gave ruthless illustration of it. Their passion was an inexhaustible source of ideas, and they quickly understood how to direct generals, scholars, or financiers faultlessly in sciences they themselves did not know. But what interests us is not this theatrical effect. What the ambitious gain in the way of intellectual power by not judging themselves inferior to anyone, they lose by judging themselves superior to everyone else. What interests us is the exploration of the powers of any man when he judges himself equal to everyone else and judges everyone else equal to him. Page 57. By the will we mean that self-reflection by the reasonable being who knows himself in the act. It is this threshold of rationality, this consciousness of and esteem for the self as a reasonable being acting, that nourishes the movement of the intelligence. The reasonable being is first of all a being who knows his power, who doesn't lie to himself about it. The principle of veracity. There are two fundamental lies, the one that proclaims, "I am telling the truth," and the one that states, "I cannot say." The reasonable being who reflects on himself knows the emptiness of these two propositions. The first fact is the impossibility of not knowing oneself. The individual cannot lie to himself, he can only forget himself. I can't is thus a sentence of self-forgetfulness, a sentence from which the reasonable individual has withdrawn. No evil genie can interpose himself between consciousness and its act. We must therefore reverse Socrates' adage. No one is voluntarily bad, he said. We will say the opposite. All blunders come from vice. 10 No one makes an error except by waywardness, that is to say, by laziness, by the desire to no longer listen to what a reasonable being owes himself. The principle of evil lies not in a mistaken knowledge of the good that is the purpose of action. It lies in unfaithfulness to oneself. Know yourself no longer means, in the Platonic manner, know where your good lies. It means come back to yourself, to what you know to be unmistakably in you. Your humility is nothing but the proud fear of stumbling in front of others. Stumbling is nothing, the wrong is in diverging from, leaving one's path, no longer paying attention to what one says, forgetting what one is. So follow your path. This principle of veracity is at the heart of the emancipation experience. It is not the key to any science, but the privileged relation of each person to the truth, the one that puts him on his path, on his orbit as a seeker. It is the moral foundation of the power to know. Page 58. This ethical foundation of the very ability to know is still a thought of its time, a fruit of the meditation on revolutionary and imperial experience. But the majority of the thinkers of the time understood it in the opposite way to Jacoto. For them, the truth that commands intellectual agreement was to be identified with the link that keeps men united. Truth is what brings together, error is rupture and solitude. Society, its institutions, the goal it pursues, these are what define the desire with which the individual must identify in order to reach a correct perception. Thus reasoned de Bonald the theocrat, and, after him, Philippe Butches the socialist and Auguste Comte the positivist. The eclectics, with their common sense and their grand truths written in the heart of each person, be he philosopher or shoemaker, were less severe. But all were men of aggregation. And Jacoto departed from them on this point. One can say, if one likes, that truth brings together. But what brings people together, what unites them, is non-aggregation. Let's rid ourselves of the representation of the social cement that hardened the thinking minds of the post-revolutionary age. People are united because they are people, that is to say, distant beings. Language doesn't unite them. On the contrary, it is the arbitrariness of language that makes them try to communicate by forcing them to translate, but also puts them in a community of intelligence. Man is a being that knows very well when someone speaking doesn't know what he is talking about. Truth doesn't bring people together at all. It is not given to us. It exists independently from us and does not submit to our piecemeal sentences. Truth exists by itself, it is that which is and not that which is said. Saying depends on man, but the truth does not. 11 But for all that, truth is not foreign to us, and we are not exiled from its country. The experience of veracity attaches us to its absent center, it makes us circle around its foyer. First of all, we can see and indicate truths. Thus, I taught what I didn't know is a truth. It's the name of a fact that existed, that can be reproduced. As for the reason for this fact, that is for the moment an opinion, and it may always remain so. Page 59. But with that opinion, we are circling around the truth, from fact to fact, relation to relation, sentence to sentence. What is essential is to avoid lying, not to say that we have seen something when we've kept our eyes closed, not to believe that something has been explained to us when it has only been named. Thus, each one of us describes our parabola around the truth. No two orbits are alike. And this is why the explicators in Dengi are revolution. These orbits of humanitarian conceptions rarely intersect and have only a few points in common. The jumbled lines that they describe never coincide without a disturbance that suspends liberty and, consequently, the use of the intelligence that follows from it. The student feels that, on his own, he wouldn't have followed the route he has just been led down, and he forgets that there are 1,000 paths in intellectual space open to his will. Point 12 This coincidence of orbits is what we have called stultification. And we understand why stultification is all the more profound, the more subtle, the less perceptible, the coincidence. This is why the Socratic method, apparently so close to universal teaching, represents the most formidable form of stultification. The Socratic method of interrogation that pretends to lead the student to his own knowledge is in fact the method of a riding schoolmaster. He orders turns, marches, and counter-marches. As for him, during the training session he is relaxed and has the dignity of authority over the mind he directs. From detour to detour, the student's mind arrives at a finish that couldn't even be glimpsed at the starting line. He is surprised to touch it, he turns around, he sees his guide, the surprise turns into admiration, and that admiration stultifies him. The student feels that, alone and abandoned to himself, he would not have followed that route. 13 No one has a relationship to the truth if he is not on his own orbit. But let no one, for all that, gloat about his singularity and go out, in his turn, to proclaim, amicus Plato, sed magis arnica veritas. That is a line from the theater. Page 60. Aristotle, who said it, was doing nothing different from Plato. Like him, he was stating his opinions, he was telling the story of his intellectual adventures. On the way, he gathered a few truths. As for the truth, it doesn't rely on philosophers who say they are its friend, it is only friends with itself. Reason and language. Truth is not told. It is a whole, and language fragments it, it is necessary, and languages are arbitrary. It was this thesis on the arbitrariness of languages even more than the proclamation of universal teaching that made Jacoto's teaching scandalous. In 1818, in his very first course at Louvain, he took as his theme this question, inherited from the 18th century of Diderot and the Abbé Batiux: is direct construction, the one that places the noun before the verb and the attribute, the natural construction? And did French writers have the right to consider that construction a mark of their language's intellectual superiority? He decided negatively. With Diderot, he judged the inverted order to be as natural as the so-called natural order, if not more so, and he believed the language of sentiment preceded that of analysis. But he attacked above all the very idea of a natural order and the hierarchies it might entail. All languages were equally arbitrary. There was no language of intelligence, no language more universal than others. The response didn't take long. In the next issue of L'Observateur Belge, a literary journal out of Brussels, a young philosopher by the name of Van Menen denounced the thesis as a theoretical warning to the oligarchy. 5 years later, after the publication of Langue Modernelle, a young lawyer close to Van Menen who had taken Jacoto's courses and even published his notes, got angry in turn. In his essay Sur le livre de Monsieur Jacoto, Jean-Sylvain Van de Weyer scolded this French professor who, after Bacon, Hobbes, Locke, Harris, Condillac, Du Marseillais, Rousseau, Destutt de Tracy, and de Bonald, still dared to maintain that thought preceded language. The position of these young and passionate contradictors is easy to understand. Page 61. They represented the young Belgium, patriotic, liberal, and French-speaking, in a state of intellectual insurrection against Flemish domination. To destroy the hierarchy of languages and the universality of the French language was, for them, to give the prize to the language of the Flemish oligarchy, the backward language of the less civilized part of the population, but also the secret language of power. Following them, the Courrier de la Muse attacked the Jacoto method for coming in the nick of time to impose at little cost the langage and the civilization in scare quotes of the Flemish. But there was more to it than this. These young defenders of the Belgian identity and the French intellectual landscape had read the Viscount de Bonald's Recherches philosophiques. They retained from it a fundamental idea, the analogy between the laws of language, the laws of society, and the laws of thought and their unity, in principle, in divine law. Undoubtedly they were departing from the Viscount's philosophical and political message. They wanted a national and constitutional monarchy, and they wanted the mind to discover freely the great metaphysical, moral, and social truths inscribed by divinity on each person's heart. Their philosophical guiding light was a young philosopher in Paris named Victor Cousin. In the thesis of the arbitrariness of languages, they saw irrationality being introduced into the heart of communication, obstructing the discovery of the true course where the philosopher's meditation must commune with the common man's common sense. They saw in the lecturer from Louvain's paradox the perpetuation of the vice of those philosophers who have frequently confused in their attacks, in the name of prejudices, both the deadly errors whose breeding ground they discovered not far from them and the fundamental truths that they attributed to the same origin. This is because the truth remained hidden from them in depths inaccessible to argumentation's scalpel and to the microscope of a verbose metaphysics, depths to which they had long ago given up descending, depths where one is guided by the clarity of good sense and a simple heart alone. 14 page 62. The fact is that Jack Otto did not want to relearn that kind of descent. He did not hear foolish sentences with good sense and a simple heart. He would have none of that fearful liberty guaranteed by the agreement of the laws of thought with the laws of language and those of society. Liberty is not guaranteed by any pre-established harmony. It is taken, it is won, it is lost, solely by each person's effort. And reason is not assured by being already written in language's constructions and the laws of the city. Language's laws have nothing to do with reason, and the laws of the city have everything to do with irrationality. If there is a divine law, thought itself, in its sustained truthfulness, alone bears witness to it. Man does not think because he speaks this would precisely submit thought to the existing material order. Man thinks because he exists. It remains that thought must be spoken, manifested in works, communicated to other thinking beings. This must be done by way of languages with arbitrary significations. One mustn't see in this an obstacle to communication. Only the lazy are afraid of the idea of arbitrariness and see in it reason's tomb. On the contrary, it is because there is no code given by divinity, no language of languages, that human intelligence employs all its art to making itself understood and to understanding what the neighboring intelligence is signifying. Thought is not told in truth, it is expressed in veracity. It is divided, it is told, it is translated for someone else, who will make of it another tale, another translation, on one condition, the will to communicate, the will to figure out what the other is thinking, and this under no guarantee beyond his narration, no universal dictionary to dictate what must be understood. Will figures out will. It is in this common effort that the definition of man as a will served by an intelligence takes on its meaning. I think and I want to communicate my thought. Immediately my intelligence artfully employs any signs whatsoever, it combines them, composes them, analyzes them, and an expression, an image, a material fact, emerges that will henceforth be for me the portrait of a thought, that is to say, of an immaterial fact. Page 63. It will recall my thought for me, and I will think of it each time I see its portrait. I can thus converse with myself when I like. And then, one day, I find myself face to face with another man, I repeat, in his presence, my gestures and my words and, if he likes, he will figure me out. But one cannot reach an agreement through words about the meaning of words. One man wants to speak, the other wants to figure it out, and that's that. From this agreement of wills there results a thought visible to two men at the same time. At first it exists immaterially for one of them, then he says it to himself, he gives form to it with his eyes or his ears, and finally he wants that form, that material being, to reproduce for another man the same primitive thought. These creations or, if you will, these metamorphoses are the effect of two wills helping each other out. Thought thus becomes speech, and then that speech or that word becomes thought again, an idea becomes matter, and that matter becomes an idea, and all this is the effect of the will. Thoughts fly from one mind to another on the wings of words. Each word is sent off with the intention of carrying just one thought, but, unknown to the one speaking and almost in spite of him, that speech, that word, that larva, is made fruitful by the listener's will, and the representative of a monad becomes the center of a sphere of ideas radiating out in all directions, such that the speaker has actually said an infinity of things beyond what he wanted to say. He has formed the body of an idea with ink, and the matter destined to mysteriously envelop a solitary immaterial being actually contains a whole world of those beings, those thoughts. Point 15. Perhaps we can now better understand the reason for universal teaching's marvels. The strengths it puts into play are simply those of any situation of communication between two reasonable beings. The relation between two ignorant people confronting the book they don't know how to read is simply a radical form of the effort one brings every minute to translating and counter-translating thoughts into words and words into thoughts. The will that presides over the operation is not a magician's secret spell. It is the desire to understand and to be understood, without which no man would ever give meaning to the materialities of language. Understanding must be understood in its true sense, not the derisive power to unveil things, but the power of translation that makes one speaker confront another. Page 64. It is the same power that allows the ignorant one to find the secret of the mute book. Despite what the Phaedrus teaches us, there are not two kinds of discourses, one of which could be deprived of the power to help itself and be condemned to stupidly repeat the same thing. All words, written or spoken, are a translation that only takes on meaning in the counter-translation, in the invention of the possible causes of the sound heard or of the written trace, the will to figure out that applies itself to all indices, in order to know what one reasonable animal has to say to what it considers the soul of another reasonable animal. Perhaps we can now better understand the scandal that made telling the story and figuring out the two master operations of the intelligence. Undoubtedly the truth-tellers and the superior minds know other ways of transforming mind into matter and matter into mind. It's understandable that they would keep these from the profane. For the latter, as for any reasonable being, there is then only this movement of speech that is at once a known distance, sustained by truth, and the consciousness of humanity, the wish to communicate with others and to verify one's similarity with them. Man is condemned to have feelings and to be silent, or, if he wishes to speak indefinitely, since he must always rectify by adding or taking away from what he just said. For whenever someone says something about it, he must hasten to add, "It isn't that." And since the rectification is no more complete than the first statement, we arrive at, in this flux and reflux, a kind of perpetual improvisation. 16. We know that improvisation is one of the canonical exercises of universal teaching. But it is first of all the exercise of our intelligence's leading virtue, the poetic virtue. The impossibility of our saying the truth, even when we feel it, makes us speak as poets, makes us tell the story of our mind's adventures and verify that they are understood by other adventurers, makes us communicate our feelings and see them shared by other feeling beings. Page 65. Improvisation is the exercise by which the human being knows himself and is confirmed in his nature as a reasonable man, that is to say, as an animal who makes words, figures, and comparisons, to tell the story of what he thinks to those like him. 17. The virtue of our intelligence is less in knowing than in doing. Knowing is nothing, doing is everything. But this doing is fundamentally an act of communication. And, for that, speaking is the best proof of the capacity to do whatever it is. 18. In the act of speaking, man doesn't transmit his knowledge, he makes poetry, he translates and invites others to do the same. He communicates as an artisan, as a person who handles words like tools. Man communicates with man through the works of his hands just as through the words of his speech. When man acts on matter, the body's adventures become the story of the mind's adventures. 19. And the artisan's emancipation is first the regaining of that story, the consciousness that one's material activity is of the nature of discourse. He communicates as a poet, as a being who believes his thought communicable, his emotions shareable. That is why speech and the conception of all works as discourse are, according to universal teaching's logic, a prerequisite to any learning. The artisan must speak about his works in order to be emancipated, the student must speak about the art he wants to learn. Speaking about human works is the way to know human art. 20. Me too, I'm a painter. From this follows the strange method by which the founder, among his other follies, taught drawing and painting. We begin by asking the student to talk about what he is going to represent, let's say a drawing to copy. It would be dangerous to give the child explanations of the measures he must take before beginning his work. We know the reason for this, the risk that the child will sense in this, his inability. We will thus trust in the child's will to imitate. But we are going to verify that will. A few days before putting a pencil in his hand, we will give him the drawing to look at, and we will ask him to talk about it. Page 66. Perhaps he will only say a few things at first, for example, the head is pretty. But we will repeat the exercise, we will show him the same head and ask him to look again and speak again, at the risk of repeating what he already said. Thus he will become more attentive, more aware of his ability and capable of imitating. We know the reason for this effect, something completely different from visual memorization and manual training. What the child has verified by this exercise is that painting is a language, that the drawing he has been asked to imitate speaks to him. Later on, we will put him in front of a painting and ask him to improvise on the unity of feeling present, for example, in that painting by Poussin of the burial of Phocion. The connoisseur will undoubtedly be shocked by this, won't he? How could you pretend to know that this is what Poussin wanted to put in his painting? And what does this hypothetical discourse have to do with Poussin's pictorial art and with the one the student is supposed to acquire? We will answer that we don't pretend to know what Poussin wanted to do. We are simply trying to imagine what he might have wanted to do. We thus verify that all wanting to do is a wanting to say, and that this wanting to say is addressed to any reasonable being. In short, we verify that the ut poesis picture the artists of the Renaissance had claimed by reversing Horace's adage is not knowledge reserved solely for artists. Painting, like sculpture, engraving, or any other art, is a language that can be understood and spoken by whoever knows the language. As far as art goes, I can't translate easily, we know, into that says nothing to me. The verification of the unity of feeling, that is to say, of the meaning of the painting, will thus be the means of emancipation for the person who doesn't know how to paint, the exact equivalent to the verification by book of the equality of intelligence. Undoubtedly, there's a great distance from this to making masterpieces. The visitors who appreciated the literary compositions of Giacoto's students often made a wry face at their paintings and drawings. Page 67. But it's not a matter of making great painters, it's a matter of making the emancipated people capable of saying, "Me too, I'm a painter," a statement that contains nothing in the way of pride, only the reasonable feeling of power that belongs to any reasonable being. There is no pride in saying out loud, "Me too, I'm a painter." Pride consists in saying softly to others, you aren't a painter." 21 Me too, I'm a painter means, me too, I have a soul, I have feelings to communicate to my fellow men. Universal teaching's method is identical to its morals. We say in universal teaching that every man who has a soul was born with a soul. In universal teaching we believe that man feels pleasure and pain, and that it is only up to him to know when, how, and by what set of circumstances he felt this pleasure or pain. What is more, man knows that there are other beings who resemble him and to whom he could communicate his feelings, provided that he places them in the circumstances to which he owes his pains and his pleasures. As soon as he knows what moved him, he can practice moving others if he studies the choice and use of the means of communication. It's a language he has to learn. Point 22 The poet's lesson. One must learn. All men hold in common the ability to feel pleasure and pain. But this resemblance is for each only a probability to be verified. And it can be verified only by the long path of the dissimilar. I must verify the reason for my thought, the humanity of my feelings, but I can do it only by making them venture forth into the forest of signs that by themselves don't want to say anything, don't correspond with that thought or that feeling. Since Boileau, it has been said that if something is well conceived, it will be clearly articulated. This sentence is meaningless. Like all sentences that surreptitiously slip from thought to matter, it expresses no intellectual adventure. Conceiving well is a resource of any reasonable person. Articulating well is an artisan's work that supposes the exercise of the tools of language. It is true that reasonable man can do anything. Page 68. But he must still learn the proper language for each of the things he wants to do, to make shoes, machines, or poems. Consider, for example, the affectionate mother who sees her son come back from a long war. The shock she feels robs her of speech. But the long embraces, the hugs of a love anxious at the very moment of happiness, a love that seems to fear a new separation, the eyes in which joy shines in the middle of tears, the mouth that smiles in order to serve as the interpreter of the equivocal language of tears, the kisses, the looks, the attitude, the sighs, even the silence. 23 All that improvisation, in short, is this not the most eloquent of poems? You feel the emotion of it, but try to communicate it. The instantaneousness of these ideas and feelings that contradict each other and are infinitely nuanced, this must be transmitted, made to voyage in the wilds of words and sentences. And the way to do that hasn't been invented. For then we would have to suppose a third level in between the individuality of that thought and common language. Would this be still another language, and how would its inventor be understood? We are left with learning, with finding the tools of that expression in books. Not in grammarians' books, they know nothing of this voyage. Not in orators' books, these don't seek to be figured out, they want to be listened to. They don't want to say anything, they want to command, to join minds, submit wills, force action. One must learn near those who have worked in the gap between feeling and expression, between the silent language of emotion and the arbitrariness of the spoken tongue, near those who have tried to give voice to the silent dialogue the soul has with itself, who have gambled all their credibility on the bet of the similarity of minds. Let's learn, then, near those poets who have been adorned with the title genius. It is they who will betray to us the secret of that imposing word. The secret of genius is that of universal teaching, learning, repeating, imitating, translating, taking apart, putting back together. In the 19th century, it is true, certain geniuses began to boast of superhuman inspiration. But the classics, those geniuses, didn't drink out of the same cup. Page 69. Racine wasn't ashamed of being what he was, a worker. He learned Euripides and Virgil by heart, like a parrot. He tried translating them, broke down their expressions, recomposed them in another way. He knew that being a poet meant translating 2 times over, translating into French verse a mother's sadness, a queen's wrath, or a lover's rage was also translating how Euripides or Virgil translated them. From Euripides' Hippolytus, one had to translate not only Phèdre that's understood but also Atelier and Joséphine. For Racine had no illusions about what he was doing. He didn't think he had a better understanding of human sentiments than his listeners. If Racine knew a mother's heart better than I, he would be wasting his time telling me what he read in it, I would not recognize his observations in my memories, and I would not be moved. This great poet presumes the opposite. All his work, all his care, all his revisions, are performed in the hope that everything will be understood by his readers exactly as he understands it himself. 24 Like all creators, Racine instinctively applied the method, that is to say, the moral, of universal teaching. He knew that there are no men of great thoughts, only men of great expressions. He knew that all the power of the poem is concentrated in 2 acts, translation and counter-translation. He knew the limits of translation and the powers of counter-translation. He knew that the poem, in a sense, is always the absence of another poem, that silent poem that a mother's tenderness or a lover's rage improvises. In a few rare effects, the first approaches the second to the point of imitating it, as in Corneille, in 1 or 3 syllables, me, or better, that he died. For the rest, the poet is suspended in the counter-translation the listener will do of it. It is the counter-translation that will produce the poem's emotion, it is the sphere of ideas radiating forth that will reanimate the words. All of the poet's effort, all his work, is to create that aura around each word, each expression. It is for this reason that he analyzes, dissects, translates others' expressions, that he tirelessly erases and corrects his own. Page 70. He strives to say everything, knowing that everything cannot be said, but that it is the unconditional tension of the translator that opens the possibility of the other tension, the other will. Language does not allow everything to be said, and I must have recourse to my own genius, to all men's genius, to figure out what Racine meant, what he would say as a man, what he says when he is not speaking, what he cannot say since he is only a poet. 25 This is the true modesty of the genius. That is to say, of the emancipated artist, he employs all his art, all his power, to show us his poem as the absence of another that he credits us with knowing as well as he. We believe ourselves to be Racine, and we are right. This belief has nothing to do with any charlatan's pretension. It in no way implies that our verse is as good as Racine's, or that it soon will be. It means first that we understand what Racine has to tell us, that his thoughts are not different from ours, and that his expressions are only achieved by our counter-translation. We know first through him that we are people like him. And we also know through him the power of a language that makes us know this via the arbitrariness of signs. We know our equality with Racine thanks to the fruit of Racine's work. His genius lies in having worked by the principle of the equality of intelligence, in having not believed himself superior to those he was speaking to, in having even worked for those who predicted that he would fade like a season. It is left to us to verify that equality, to conquer that power through our own work. This does not mean making tragedies equal to Racine's, it means, rather, employing as much attention, as much artistic research as he, to recounting how we feel and to making others feel it, despite the arbitrariness of language or the resistance of all matter to the work of our hands. The artist's emancipatory lesson, opposed on every count to the professor's stultifying lesson, is this: each one of us is an artist to the extent that he carries out a double process. He is not content to be a mere journeyman but wants to make all work a means of expression, and he is not content to feel something but tries to impart it to others. The artist needs equality as the explicator needs inequality. Page 71. And he therefore designs the model of a reasonable society where the very thing that is outside of reason, matter, linguistic signs, is traversed by reasonable will, that of telling the story and making others feel the ways in which we are similar to them. The community of equals. We can thus dream of a society of the emancipated that would be a society of artists. Such a society would repudiate the division between those who know and those who don't, between those who possess or don't possess the property of intelligence. It would only know minds in action, people who do, who speak about what they are doing, and who thus transform all their works into ways of demonstrating the humanity that is in them as in everyone. Such people would know that no one is born with more intelligence than his neighbor, that the superiority that someone might manifest is only the fruit of as tenacious an application to working with words as another might show to working with tools, that the inferiority of someone else is the consequence of circumstances that didn't compel him to seek harder. In short, they would know that the perfection someone directs toward his own art is no more than the particular application of the power common to all reasonable beings, the one that each person feels when he withdraws into that privacy of consciousness where lying makes no sense. They would know that man's dignity is independent of his position, that man is not born to a particular position, but is meant to be happy in himself, independently of what fate brings. 26 And that the reflection of feeling that shines in the eyes of a wife, a son, or a dear friend presents to the gaze of a sensitive enough soul equate satisfaction. Such people would not be occupied creating phalansteries where vocations would correspond to passions, communities of equals, economic organizations harmoniously distributing functions and resources. Page 72. To unite humankind, there is no better link than this identical intelligence in everyone. It is this that is the just measure of similarity, igniting that gentle penchant of the heart that leads us to help each other and love each other. It is this that gives someone the means of measuring the extent of the services that he can hope for from his fellow man and of devising ways to show him his appreciation. But let's not talk like utilitarians. The principal service that man can expect from man depends on that faculty of intercommunicating their pleasure and pain, hopes and fears, in order to be moved reciprocally. If men didn't have the faculty, an equal faculty, they would soon become strangers to each other. They would scatter at random throughout the globe and societies would be dissolved. The exercise of that power is at once the sweetest of our pleasures and the most demanding of our needs. 27 We scarcely have to ask what these wise people would have in the way of laws, magistrates, assemblies, and tribunals. People who obey the dictates of reason have no need of laws and magistrates. The Stoics knew that already. Virtue that knows itself, the virtue of knowing oneself, is the guiding power of all other virtues. But we ourselves know that reason is not the privilege of the wise. There are no madmen except those who insist on inequality and domination, those who want to be right. Reason begins when discourses organized with the goal of being right cease, begins where equality is recognized, not an equality decreed by law or force, not a passively received equality, but an equality in act, verified, at each step by those marchers who, in their constant attention to themselves and in their endless revolving around the truth, find the right sentences to make themselves understood by others. We must therefore reverse the critics' questions. How, they ask, is a thing like the equality of intelligence thinkable? And how could this opinion be established without disrupting the social order? We must ask the opposite question: how is intelligence possible without equality? Intelligence is not a power of understanding based on comparing knowledge with its object. Page 73. It is the power to make oneself understood through an other's verification. And only an equal understands an equal. Equality and intelligence are synonymous terms, exactly like sun and wool. This synonymy on which each man's intellectual capacity is based is also what makes society, in general, possible. The equality of intelligence is the common bond of humankind, the necessary and sufficient condition for a society of men to exist. If men considered themselves equal, the Constitution would soon be completed. 28 It is true that we don't know that men are equal. We are saying that they might be. This is our opinion, and we are trying, along with those who think as we do, to verify it. But we know that this might is the very thing that makes a society of humans possible.